On a summer afternoon in 1876, the most feared gunfighter in America sat down at a poker table in a Deadwood saloon and did something no one had ever seen him do. He put his back to the door. Within hours, he was dead, still holding his cards. Wild Bill Hickok was the first. Over the next 32 years, 8 more legends of the American frontier would follow him. And almost none of them died the way the stories promised. They were shot from behind, betrayed by people they trusted, or found alone in the wilderness under circumstances that have never been fully explained. These are the last hours of 9 frontier legends, told in the order they fell. Wild Bill Hickok, the Dead Man's Hand. The story begins in Deadwood, a mining camp in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory that in the summer of 1876 technically did not exist. The land still belonged to the Lakota by treaty, which meant Deadwood had no legal courts, no legal government, and thousands of gold seekers who came anyway. James Butler Hickok arrived in July with a wagon train that included his friend Colorado Charlie Utter and a young woman history remembers as Calamity Jane. Hickok was 39 years old. His days as a lawman in Kansas were behind him. His eyesight was reportedly failing, and he made his living now at the card tables. He seems to have sensed something. In a letter written to his new wife Agnes that summer, he told her that if they never met again, she should know he had breathed her name with his last breath. Historians still debate whether that was premonition or simply the way a frontier gambler wrote to a wife he barely knew. On the afternoon of August 2nd, Hickok walked into Nuttall & Mann's Saloon No. 10 and joined a poker game already in progress. His habit, known to everyone, was to sit against the wall where he could watch the room. That day, the wall seat was taken by a player named Charlie Rich. When Hickok asked to switch, twice by some accounts, Rich refused. Hickok sat down anyway, facing the bar, his back to the rear entrance. Sometime after 4 o'clock, a drifter named Jack McCall walked in, moved down the bar, stepped behind Hickok, and fired a single shot into the back of his head. The bullet passed through, exited his cheek, and lodged in the wrist of a riverboat captain sitting across the table. Hickok died instantly. On the table in front of him lay 2 black aces and 2 black 8s. The hand gamblers have called the Dead Man's Hand ever since. The 5th card has been argued about for a century and a half, and honestly, no one knows. What happened next says everything about Deadwood. A miners' jury, assembled in a town with no legal authority, heard McCall claim Hickok had killed his brother, deliberated, and let him go. Only when McCall bragged about the killing in Wyoming was he arrested again, retried in a real court, and hanged in 1877. The first trial simply did not count, because legally, Deadwood itself did not count. The question that lingers is quieter than the murder. Why did the most watchful man on the frontier accept the one seat he had spent his whole life refusing? Sam Bass, the Texas outlaw who died on his birthday. 2 years later, and 1,000 miles south, a 26-year-old Texan named Sam Bass was the most wanted man in the state. In 1877, his gang had robbed a Union Pacific train at Big Springs, Nebraska, and ridden off with $60,000 in freshly minted gold coins, one of the largest hauls of the era. Bass spent that gold freely across North Texas, and something unusual happened. Farmers and small ranchers, squeezed by railroads and banks, started covering for him. Posses chased Sam Bass through the cross timbers for months and came back with nothing. So, the Texas Rangers stopped chasing him and went inside instead. A gang member named Jim Murphy, facing federal charges, agreed to inform in exchange for leniency. In July of 1878, he rode with the gang toward the town of Round Rock, sending letters ahead the whole way. The plan was to scout the Williamson County Bank. On the afternoon of July 19th, Bass and 2 companions walked into a store on Round Rock's Main Street to buy tobacco. Rangers and deputies were already scattered through the town. A deputy sheriff named A.W. Grimes approached the strangers, likely to ask about the pistols under their coats, and was shot dead where he stood. The street erupted. In the running gunfight that followed, outlaw Seaborn Barnes was killed instantly, and Bass was hit through the hand and then through the back as he tried to reach the horses. His young partner, Frank Jackson, held off the shooters, pulled Bass into the saddle, and got him out of town. The Rangers found Bass the next morning sitting under a tree north of Round Rock, alone, asking for help. He had told Jackson to save himself. For 2 days, lawmen questioned the dying outlaw about his partners and the men who had sheltered him, and Bass gave them nothing. His reported answer was that it was against his profession to blow on his friends, and that, if a man knows anything, he ought to die with it. He died on July 21, 1878. It was his 27th birthday. Jim Murphy, the informant, outlived him by less than a year, dying after taking poison that was officially medicine for his eyes. Many in Texas believed he could no longer stand waiting for the friends of Sam Bass to find him. Billy the Kid, the shot in the dark. In April of 1881, Billy the Kid was sitting in Lincoln, New Mexico, under a death sentence when he killed his 2 guards, one with the guard's own shotgun, and rode out of town while the county watched. Every account agrees on what he should have done next. Mexico was a few days' ride south, and no one was going to follow him there. Instead, the Kid drifted back to Fort Sumner, a crumbling former army post on the Pecos River where he had friends, dances, and by most accounts, a sweetheart. He stayed for weeks within reach of the very territory hunting him. Sheriff Pat Garrett, who had captured him once before, heard the rumors, and on the night of July 14th, rode into Fort Sumner with 2 deputies to question Pete Maxwell, a rancher who knew everyone in the settlement. Near midnight, Garrett sat in the darkness of Maxwell's bedroom, waking him quietly. And here the story turns on a piece of hanging beef. Billy, at a friend's place nearby, had gotten hungry. He picked up a butcher knife to cut meat from a carcass hanging on Maxwell's porch and walked over bareheaded in his stocking feet. On the porch, he nearly walked into Garrett's deputies, 2 strangers, and instead of running, he backed through the doorway into Maxwell's pitch-dark room, asking in Spanish, "¿Quién es? ¿Quién es? Who is it?" Garrett, sitting at the head of the bed, recognized the voice, drew, and fired twice. The first bullet struck the Kid just above the heart. He was dead within moments at 21 years old. Almost immediately, the questions began. Deputy John Poe, standing outside, later wrote that he doubted the dead man was armed with anything but the knife, though Garrett's account gave him a revolver. The inquest was assembled overnight from local residents, finished quickly, and the Kid was buried the next day in the old military cemetery. That speed left just enough room for a legend, and for decades, men like Brushy Bill Roberts would claim the grave at Fort Sumner held someone else. The record does not support them, but the record also cannot answer the simpler mystery: why a man with a death sentence and a clear road to Mexico chose to stay home. Jesse James, the shot from behind. 9 months later, the most famous outlaw in America died while standing on a chair. By April of 1882, Jesse James was living quietly on a hilltop in St. Joseph, Missouri, in a small white frame house at 1318 Lafayette Street, under the name Thomas Howard. His wife Z and their 2 children lived there with him. His old gang was gone, dead, imprisoned, or scattered. For his last planned robbery, he had recruited 2 young brothers, Charlie and Bob Ford. What Jesse did not know was that Bob Ford had already met secretly with the governor of Missouri, Thomas Crittenden, and that a $10,000 reward was on the table. On the warm morning of April 3rd, the 3 men ate breakfast while Jesse read the newspaper. In it was a report that his former gang member Dick Little had surrendered and was cooperating, a fact the Fords knew and had not mentioned. Bob Ford later said Jesse went quiet at the page, and the brothers were convinced they had just been found out. Then Jesse did something no one has ever fully explained. He stood, remarked that it was hot, and took off his coat. And because a passing neighbor might see through the window, he unbuckled both revolvers, guns he wore even inside his own house, and laid them on the bed. He noticed a framed picture on the wall, hanging crooked and dusty, pulled a chair over, and stepped up to straighten it. Bob Ford drew and shot him behind the right ear from a few feet away. Jesse James died on his parlor floor at 34, with his wife running in from the kitchen. The Fords wired the governor claiming their reward, were charged with first-degree murder, pleaded guilty, were sentenced to hang, and were pardoned, all within a matter of weeks. The arrangement was that obvious. Neither brother escaped the moment. Charlie, sick and haunted, took his own life in 1884. Bob toured for years reenacting the killing on stage to audiences that increasingly hated him, and in 1892, he was shot dead in his own tent saloon in Creede, Colorado. The unresolved question sits in that parlor. Some historians read Jesse's mourning as pure routine. Others look at the newspaper, the removed guns, and the turned back offered to two nervous young men he had reason to distrust, and wonder whether a hunted man was, in some way, done running. Johnny Ringo, the man in the tree. That same summer, in the mountains of southeastern Arizona, a body was found sitting in a tree. Johnny Ringo occupies a strange place in Western memory. He was a gunman of the Tombstone faction wars, an educated man by reputation, moody and hard drinking, an enemy of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday. By July of 1882, his world had collapsed. His allies among the so-called cowboys were dead or scattered after the Earp vendetta ride, and witnesses in the area later described Ringo on a multi-day drinking spree, riding out of Tombstone alone. On July 14th, a teamster found him in West Turkey Creek Canyon in the Chiricahua Mountains, seated in the fork of a large oak tree as if he had settled in to rest. There was a bullet wound in his right temple, an exit wound at the back of his head, and his revolver was hanging from one finger of his hand. A coroner's jury ruled it suicide, and given his state of mind that month, the ruling was reasonable. But the details found at that tree have kept the case alive for more than a century. Ringo's boots were gone, and his feet were wrapped in strips torn from his undershirt. His horse was found days later some distance away with the boots tied to the saddle. His cartridge belt was buckled on upside down. None of that is impossible for a man alone in the wilderness. Riders sometimes hung their boots on the saddle, and a disoriented, exhausted man protects his feet however he can. It is just strange, and stranger men than Ringo were nearby that year. Buckskin Frank Leslie, a Tombstone gunman, reportedly boasted of the killing years later. Decades afterward, accounts attributed to Wyatt Earp's circle claimed Earp had slipped back into Arizona and done it himself, a story most historians treat as legend polishing a legend. The truth is that no evidence has ever overturned the coroner's ruling, and no explanation has ever made all the details fit comfortably. Johnny Ringo remains what he was that July morning, a man found alone at the base of the mountains, keeping his answer to himself. Doc Holliday, the quiet end. Now we move from a canyon in Arizona to a sick room in Colorado. Doc Holliday always said he expected to die from a bullet, and he treated the expectation almost like a plan. John Henry Holliday was a Georgia dentist with a classical education who came west in the 1870s because tuberculosis was destroying his lungs, and dry air was the only medicine anyone could offer. He built his reputation at gambling tables and in gunfights, most famously beside the Earps at the OK Corral in Tombstone in 1881. Through all of it, the disease kept its own schedule. By May of 1887, Holliday had traveled to Glenwood Springs, Colorado, a resort town in the Rockies famous for its enormous hot springs, hoping the sulfur waters might ease his failing lungs. The 19th century believed in those vapors. Modern medicine suggests they likely made a tubercular man worse. Through the summer and fall, he declined steadily. For his final 57 days, he was confined to bed at the Hotel Glenwood, drifting in and out of delirium, nursed by hotel staff, and according to some accounts, sustained by small doses of the whiskey that had accompanied his whole adult life. On the morning of November 8, 1887, the story goes that he woke clear-eyed, asked for a glass of whiskey, drank it, looked down at his bare feet, and said, "This is funny." Then he died. He was 36. The joke, as the legend explains it, was that a man who had spent 15 years courting death in saloons was dying in bed with his boots off. It is a perfect ending, and that is exactly why it deserves a careful look. The line does not appear in the newspaper accounts of his death from that week. It surfaces in later tellings, and the local paper reported he had been largely delirious at the end. So, the famous last words may be true, or they may be the West already writing its own screenplay. What the record does confirm is in some ways sadder and more human. The most feared gambler on the frontier died quietly, far from Georgia, attended by strangers, and was buried in Linwood Cemetery on the hill above town, in a grave whose exact location was poorly recorded and is uncertain to this day. Even in death, Doc Holliday kept the town guessing. Belle Starr, the bandit queen's unanswered murder. The only woman on this list died on a muddy road in Indian Territory, and her murder was never solved. Belle Starr had been made famous by newspapers and dime novelists as the Bandit Queen, a title that exaggerated a real but modest criminal career. She had ridden with and married into outlaw circles for decades, was convicted of horse theft in Judge Isaac Parker's famous Fort Smith Court, and by 1889 was living at a bend of the Canadian River called Younger's Bend, renting land to sharecroppers and trying by some accounts to keep the wanted men of the territory at arm's length. On February 3, 1889, 2 days before her 41st birthday, Belle rode home from a neighbor's house near Eufaula. At a fence corner along the road, someone was waiting with a shotgun. The first blast hit her in the back and knocked her from the saddle. The second was fired into her neck and face as she lay in the road. Her horse ran home without her, which is how her daughter Pearl knew to go looking. The suspect list assembled itself almost immediately, and it has never gotten shorter. First was Edgar Watson, a tenant farmer to whom Belle had leased land before learning he was wanted for murder in Florida. She had canceled the arrangement, and some said she had hinted she knew his past. The killing happened near his place, and he was arrested and tried, but the evidence was thin and he was acquitted. Watson drifted back to Florida, where years later he was himself shot dead by his own neighbors, suspected in a string of killings. The second suspect was Belle's own son, Eddie Reed, a troubled young man she had reportedly horsewhipped shortly before her death over a mistreated horse. The third was her husband, Jim July, whose insistence on prosecuting Watson struck some observers as a little too energetic. No one was ever convicted. Pearl buried her mother at Younger's Bend under a headstone carved with a bell, a star, and her favorite mare. The road by the fence corner kept it secret. Of the 9 deaths in this story, Belle Starr's is the one where every trail simply stops. John Wesley Hardin, the fastest gun shot from behind. By 1895, John Wesley Hardin was something the frontier had never seen before, a legendary killer with a law license. Hardin was plausibly the deadliest man of the entire era. He claimed 42 killings in the autobiography he was writing, and even skeptical historians credit him with more than 20, beginning in his teens in Reconstruction, Texas. He had spent nearly 17 years in Huntsville prison, studied law inside its walls, and emerged in 1894 as a pardoned man determined briefly to live respectably. It lasted about a year. Hardin set up a law practice in El Paso, the last truly wild town in Texas, and slid back into gambling, heavy drinking, and a public affair with a client, the wife of an outlaw, a woman named Beulah Morose. When an old constable named John Selman arrested her that August, Hardin made loud threats against Selman all over town, and El Paso waited to see what would happen. On the evening of August 19, 1895, Hardin stood at the bar of the Acme Saloon, rolling dice with a local grocer named Henry Brown. His last recorded words were about the game, "Brown, you've got 4 6s to beat." Behind him, John Selman stepped through the doorway and shot him in the back of the head, then fired into him again as he lay on the floor. Selman's defense at trial was remarkable. He claimed he had seen Hardin watching him in the mirror behind the bar, which made the shot self-defense against the fastest gun in Texas. The mirror question has been argued ever since, because if Hardin saw him, he did nothing. And if he did not, Selman shot an unarmed man's turned back. The jury could not agree, and before Selman could be retried, the story consumed him too. In April of 1896, he was shot dead in an El Paso alley by lawman George Scarborough after an argument about, among other things, the Hardin killing. 4 years later, Scarborough was fatally wounded in a gunfight with outlaws on the anniversary of the day he killed Selman. In El Paso, they noticed the date. The frontier was closing, and the men who had made it dangerous seemed to be closing each other out with it. Pat Garrett, the man who killed Billy, the kid, which brings the story back around to where it almost began, because the last of the 9 is the man who shot Billy the Kid. Pat Garrett's reward for ending the most famous manhunt in New Mexico's history turned out to be a long, slow decline. The fame never converted into fortune. He wrote a book about the kid that sold poorly, held and lost appointments, ran up debts, quarreled with neighbors, and by 1908 was a struggling rancher in the Oregon Mountains outside Las Cruces, landlocked into a lease he regretted. He had rented his ranch to a young cowboy named Wayne Brazel, and Brazel had stocked it with goats, more than 1,000 of them, which soured every attempt Garrett made to sell the land to cattlemen. On February 29, 1908, Leap Day, Garrett rode toward Las Cruces in a buggy with a man named Carl Adamson, part of yet another tangled deal to clear the goats off the ranch. Brazel rode alongside on horseback, and the argument continued down the road. About 4 miles from town, Garrett had the buggy stop and stepped down to relieve himself at the roadside. He had removed his glove, and his folding shotgun was down in the buggy. He was shot in the back of the head and again in the stomach and left in the sand. Brazel rode into Las Cruces and confessed within the hour, claiming self-defense, and Adamson, the only witness, backed him. Almost nothing about the scene fit that story, beginning with the direction of the shots and what Garrett was doing when the first one struck. It did not matter. At trial in 1909, the jury acquitted Wayne Brazel in about 15 minutes, and a celebration was reportedly held afterward. In the century since, historians have assembled a larger picture, a web of ranchers who wanted Garrett's land and Garrett gone, and the presence in the buggy deal of Jim Miller, a polite, church-going Texan, widely believed to be a professional assassin, who was lynched in Oklahoma the following year for exactly that line of work. Whether Brazel fired the shot he confessed to or covered for the man who did has never been settled. The man who ended the kid in a dark bedroom in 1881 was himself shot from behind on an open road 27 years later, in a world that now had automobiles, telephones, and no more room for him. The pattern that binds them all. 9 legends and 1 pattern. Hickok died the one afternoon he sat with his back to the door. Jesse James died in the few minutes his guns were off. Billy the Kid walked into the dark asking who's there. Hardin was watching dice. Garrett was standing at a roadside. Belle Starr was riding home. Even Ringo and Holliday, whatever we make of their endings, died alone and unarmed against the things that were actually killing them. These were the most vigilant people of their era, men and a woman who survived years of open violence, and almost every one of them was taken in an ordinary, unguarded, human moment. The dime novels and the movies gave us duels at high noon because the truth was harder to sell. The truth is that the Old West did not end in showdowns. It ended in backshots, sick rooms, courtrooms that looked the other way, and questions that were never answered in canyons, parlors, and county roads. Maybe that is the honest way to remember them, not as gunfighters frozen at the moment of the draw, but as people who ran out of the one thing that had kept them alive, which was never speed. It was attention. If a chapter of this story stayed with you, tell us which one in the comments. And if you want more of the frontier as it actually happened, the next documentary is waiting on screen. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next deep dive into the real history behind the legends. We'll see you in the next one.